My beloved child. Stop scrolling for a moment. Do not rush past these words, because there is something waiting for you inside this message that your heart has been quietly asking for. What you are about to hear was meant to find you at a moment when you were not expecting it. And if you have been feeling lately that something has changed around your connection, if you have sensed distance, silence, hesitation, or an emotion you could not explain, then pause here. Because today, something happened. Something your soulmate did not plan. Something they did not know how to explain. And something inside them became so overwhelming that they finally reached for their phone and began typing the words they had been afraid to send. I need to tell you what happened today, it's very urgent. Please open this. Those words were not written casually. They were written after a day that shook something loose inside their heart. And before you hear what happened, I want you to understand something important. This is a fictional spiritual story created for reflection, inspiration, and entertainment. Let the message speak to your emotions without treating it as a literal prediction of another person's private thoughts. Sometimes a story becomes powerful because it gives language to feelings we have never been able to express ourselves. Now breathe. Slow down. Because in this story, your soulmate woke up this morning believing it would be an ordinary day. They had plans. They had responsibilities. They had conversations to handle. They had a life that, from the outside, looked completely normal. But beneath that ordinary surface was a thought they had been carrying for much longer than they wanted to admit. You. They had tried to push the thought away. They had told themselves that they were fine. They had convinced themselves that enough time had passed. They had even laughed with people around them and acted as though your absence no longer mattered. But there are some people the heart does not simply forget because the mind orders it to. And there are some connections that remain emotionally unfinished long after two people stop speaking. This morning, your soulmate opened their eyes and reached for their phone. For a few seconds, everything was normal. Then they saw something that reminded them of you. It could have been an old photograph. A familiar place. A song. A name. A message. A memory appearing unexpectedly. Something small. Something ordinary. But instead of disappearing into the background, that little reminder opened a door inside them. And behind that door was everything they had been trying not to feel. They remembered the way you used to speak. They remembered a conversation they once dismissed. They remembered a moment when you looked at them and seemed to understand something they had never said aloud. They remembered how you were there during a season when they did not even know they needed someone. And then another memory came. Then another. And suddenly, the person who had convinced themselves they were over it was sitting quietly, staring at their phone, wondering why your name still had the power to make their chest feel heavy. They whispered to themselves, "Why today?" That question followed them through the morning. They tried to work. They tried to focus. They tried to answer messages. They tried to participate in conversations. But something felt different. You were not physically there. Yet somehow, emotionally, you seemed closer than you had been in a long time. They began remembering the things they never told you. The apology they never gave. The truth they softened. The fear they disguised as indifference. The affection they hid behind silence. And most importantly, they remembered the moment when they could have chosen honesty but chose protection instead. They protected their ego. They protected their image. They protected themselves from vulnerability. And in doing so, they may have hurt the one person who had been asking for nothing more complicated than honesty. That realization began to disturb them. Because sometimes regret does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly. It sits beside you while you drink your morning tea. It follows you while you walk through a crowded room. It appears when everyone else is laughing. It waits until the noise disappears. And then it whispers. What if you had told them the truth? Your soulmate tried to ignore that question. But today, they could not. Around midday, something happened that made the question impossible to escape. They encountered someone connected to the past. Someone who knew something about your story. Maybe it was a mutual friend. Maybe it was someone who had watched everything unfold from a distance. Maybe it was simply a person who remembered you. They began talking casually. At first, your name did not come up. Then somehow, it did. Just one sentence. Just one mention. And your soulmate froze. The other person noticed. They looked at your soulmate and asked, "Are you okay?" Your soulmate smiled. That automatic smile people use when they are trying to hide an emotional reaction. "I'm fine." But they were not fine. The conversation continued. And then the other person said something unexpected. Something that changed the entire atmosphere. They said, "You know, I always thought you cared more than you admitted." Your soulmate went silent. For several seconds, they had no answer. Because that sentence touched the exact place they had been avoiding. They could have laughed it off. They could have changed the subject. They could have said it was complicated. Instead, they looked down. And for the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to admit something. "Yes," they said quietly. "I did." The other person asked, "Then why did you let it go?" That question hurt. Not because they did not know the answer. Because they knew too many answers. Fear. Timing. Pride. Confusion. Other responsibilities. Bad decisions. Misunderstandings. The desire to appear strong. The fear of being rejected. The fear that if they confessed everything, they would lose whatever connection remained. They had created so many reasons that eventually those reasons became a wall. And behind that wall was the truth. They still cared. That realization followed them after the conversation ended. They walked away physically, but emotionally they were still standing in that moment. They kept hearing the question. "Then why did you let it go?" And suddenly, memories began coming back with frightening clarity. They remembered a day when you needed reassurance and they gave you silence. They remembered when you were waiting for them to make a decision and they delayed. They remembered when you tried to understand them and they responded defensively. They remembered a time when you probably wondered whether you mattered to them. And they remembered how they pretended not to care that you were hurt. That was the moment regret became heavier. Because your soulmate realized something they had never fully understood before. You may have walked away not because you stopped caring. You may have walked away because caring without clarity became too painful. And that thought broke something inside them. They went somewhere private. They sat down. They looked at their phone. They opened your conversation. They stared at your name. Their thumb hovered over the keyboard. They typed. "Hey." Deleted it. They typed. "Can we talk?" Deleted it. They typed. "I need to tell you something." Deleted it. Then they put the phone down. They stood up. They walked around. They came back. They picked it up again. This time, they did not try to sound calm. They did not try to sound mysterious. They did not try to protect their pride. They typed the words exactly as they felt them. "I need to tell you what happened today." They stopped. Their heart was beating faster. They knew that once they continued, they could not take the truth back. Then they added. "It's very urgent." They stared at those words. And something inside them whispered. "Send it." But they still hesitated. Because the urgency was not about danger. It was emotional urgency. The kind that appears when someone realizes that another day of silence might become another year of silence. They thought about you. They wondered whether you had moved on. They wondered whether you would even open the message. They wondered whether you still remembered them. And then came the thought that frightened them most. What if I waited too long? That question finally pushed their finger toward the screen. The message was sent. And then came silence. They watched the screen. Nothing. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5. They put the phone down. Picked it up again. Still nothing. They began imagining every possible response. Maybe you would ignore them. Maybe you would ask what happened. Maybe you would say it was too late. Maybe you would be angry. Maybe you would simply say, I'm listening. And strangely, that possibility frightened them the most. Because if you listened, they would have to tell the truth. No more excuses. No more half-truths. No more pretending. The truth. And the truth was much deeper than, I miss you. They missed you, yes. But that was only the surface. The real confession was that they had finally understood what your presence had meant. You had not simply been another person in their life. You had represented a version of themselves they were afraid to become. Around you, they had seen their own emotional weaknesses. Their fears. Their insecurities. Their need for control. Their inability to communicate. And instead of growing through those things, they sometimes ran from them. They thought distance would make everything easier. But distance did not erase the connection. It only made the unanswered questions louder. As the afternoon passed, your soulmate became increasingly restless. They tried to distract themselves. They went outside. They talked to people. They watched something on their phone. They ate. They worked. But every few minutes their attention returned to the same screen. Your conversation. Your name. That unanswered message. And then something happened that they did not expect. A memory appeared. Not a dramatic memory. Not a huge event. Something tiny. They remembered the way you once asked if they had eaten. They remembered the way you noticed when they were tired. They remembered how you could sense when something was wrong even when they said nothing. They remembered the small kindnesses they had once taken for granted. And suddenly, they realized why your absence had felt so strange. It was not simply that they missed a person. They missed being understood. They missed the emotional safety they had not recognized while they had it. Their eyes filled with tears. They looked away. They tried to laugh at themselves. Why am I crying? But the tears came anyway. Because there are moments when the heart becomes tired of pretending. They wiped their face. Then they remembered something else. The last time you truly tried to reach them. The way you were patient. The way you gave them another chance to explain themselves. And the way they wasted that chance. That memory hurt more than everything else. They whispered. I should have told them. And for the first time, they understood that sometimes people do not lose someone because love disappeared. Sometimes they lose someone because fear was louder than love. That realization changed the tone of the entire day. They stopped blaming circumstances. They stopped blaming timing. They stopped blaming you. They began looking at themselves. And what they saw was uncomfortable. They saw a person who had wanted closeness but feared vulnerability. A person who wanted to be understood but did not explain themselves. A person who wanted love but was terrified of what real love would demand from them. Responsibility. Honesty. Consistency. Courage. They realized that perhaps they had wanted the comfort of your presence without accepting the responsibility of protecting your heart. That thought made them cry again. Not because they wanted sympathy. Because they finally understood the cost. You had been carrying emotional weight that should never have belonged entirely to you. And somewhere in that realization, your soulmate made a decision. They would tell you. Not everything in one perfect speech. Not with dramatic promises. Not with manipulation. But honestly. Even if the truth made them look weak. Even if you rejected them. Even if you had already moved on. They needed you to know. So they opened the conversation again. They typed. I don't know if you want to hear this. They stopped. Then. But something happened today that made me realize I can't keep pretending. They stopped again. Their hands trembled. Then. I've been carrying something for a long time. Another pause. Then the message they had been afraid to send. You were never as unimportant to me as I made you believe. They stared at the sentence. And tears fell again. Because that was the truth. You had mattered. More than they admitted. More than they showed. More than their behavior sometimes suggested. And perhaps that was the most painful part. They had loved in silence while behaving in ways that could make you believe you were not loved at all. They knew there was no excuse for that. So they continued typing. I know I confused you. I know I hurt you. I know there were moments when you probably thought I didn't care. I did care. I was just afraid. They stopped. Then another thought came. What if you interpreted "afraid" as another excuse? They deleted the sentence. Typed it again. Deleted it. Finally, they wrote. I don't want to use fear as an excuse anymore. That was the sentence that made them feel different. Because they were no longer asking you to understand their behavior. They were finally taking responsibility for it. Outside, the day was beginning to darken. The light through the window softened. The world continued moving. Cars passed. People laughed. Phones rang. Messages arrived. But your soulmate sat in a quiet room feeling as though the entire world had paused. They looked at the unfinished message. Then they realized something. There was one thing they had never told you. The thing that had been at the center of everything. The reason they had pulled away. The reason they sometimes acted cold. The reason they seemed uncertain even when their emotions were strong. It was not what you thought. And this was where the day became something they would never forget. Because earlier, when that mutual person had asked why they let you go, your soulmate had almost told the truth. Almost. But they stopped. Now, sitting alone, they knew they could no longer hide it. They began typing again. I need you to know something about that time. Their heart raced. I didn't leave because you weren't enough. They stared at the screen. Then continued. I left because I was convinced that eventually you would discover that I wasn't enough for you. They put the phone down. That sentence exposed everything. The insecurity. The fear. The shame. The hidden belief that they would eventually disappoint you. They had not been rejecting you as much as they had been rejecting themselves. And because they could not imagine being worthy of the love they felt from you, they created distance before you could create it for them. That was the secret beneath so many of their actions. And now they were finally seeing it. They remembered the moments when you asked, "What is wrong?" They remembered answering, "Nothing." But there had always been something. There was fear. Fear that you would see behind the mask. Fear that you would discover their flaws. Fear that one day you would realize you deserved someone more emotionally available. So they tried to control the ending. They thought leaving first would hurt less. It did not. It only guaranteed that both of you would carry unanswered questions. Your soulmate looked at the message again. They had written enough to explain. But they had not yet said the sentence that mattered most. They took a deep breath. And finally wrote. I still care about you. They paused. Then. I don't know what you will do with that truth. Another pause. But I couldn't go another day without giving it to you. They read the entire message. Their hands were shaking. Then they saw that you were online. Their heart stopped. You were there. You might see it. You might open it. They almost deleted everything. For one terrifying second, the old fear returned. Don't send it. Protect yourself. Stay silent. Nothing good will come from this. But another voice inside them answered. You have already spent enough time hiding. They pressed send. The message disappeared from the screen. Delivered. Now there was nothing left to control. Your soulmate leaned back. Closed their eyes. And breathed. For the first time in a long time, they had told the truth without knowing what they would receive in return. And strangely, they felt lighter. Not because they knew what would happen. They didn't. Not because they knew you would come back. They didn't. But because they had finally stopped asking you to guess what was inside their heart. They had opened the door. And now the choice belonged to you. But there was still one thing they had not told you. The most important part of the day. The thing that had made them realize they needed to contact you immediately. The thing that happened before they met that mutual person. The thing that started this entire chain of memories. And now, as they sat staring at the screen, they remembered it clearly. Earlier that morning, before anyone mentioned your name, before the conversation, before the tears, your soulmate had received something unexpected. It was not a message from you. It was not a phone call. It was not a photograph. It was something much simpler. They had walked past a place connected to you. A place they had not visited in a long time. And there, unexpectedly, they saw something that brought the entire past rushing back. Something you once said. Something they had forgotten. A sentence. One sentence. And suddenly they understood why you had walked away. Not because you stopped caring. Not because the connection meant nothing. But because you had reached a point where you could no longer keep proving your love to someone who would not meet you halfway. That realization hit them like a wave. They understood that your silence may have been the final language you had left. And instead of feeling angry, they felt humbled. They realized you had already told them everything. They simply had not been ready to listen. That was what happened today. Not a miracle in the way people imagine miracles. Something quieter. Something more human. A heart finally becoming honest. A person finally seeing the consequences of their own choices. A soul finally understanding that love cannot survive forever on assumptions. And perhaps that is why this message found you. Not to promise that someone will suddenly appear at your door. Not to tell you that you should abandon your boundaries. Not to convince you to chase someone who has not shown you consistency. But to remind you of something powerful. You deserve clarity. You deserve honesty. You deserve someone who does not make you spend sleepless nights interpreting silence. You deserve love that does not require you to become a detective. And if someone truly wants to return to your life, let their actions speak alongside their words. Let them take responsibility. Let them communicate. Let them show growth. Do not mistake emotional intensity for emotional maturity. Do not mistake a dramatic confession for a changed person. A true reconciliation is not built on nostalgia. It is built on accountability. And that is exactly what your soulmate in this story is beginning to understand. They looked at the phone again. Still no response. They waited. Then another minute passed. Then another. And suddenly, the screen lit up. A notification. Your name. Their breath stopped. They opened it. And what they saw made their entire body go still. You had replied. Not with anger. Not with a long paragraph. Not with an accusation. Just one sentence. One sentence that somehow contained everything. They read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Their eyes filled with tears. Because your response was not what they expected. It was not forgiveness. It was not rejection. It was something much more powerful. You had written. I was waiting for you to finally tell me the truth. Your soulmate covered their face with their hands. And for several moments, they could not move. Because suddenly, all the years of confusion collapsed into one realization. You had not needed perfection. You had needed honesty. They began crying again. But this time the tears were different. They were not only tears of regret. They were tears of relief. Because the door they had been terrified to knock on had not completely disappeared. But they also knew something. A door being opened does not mean you can walk through it without changing. They had work to do. They had apologies to make. They had trust to rebuild. They had to prove that this message was not another temporary emotional moment. And perhaps that is where the real spiritual lesson begins. Because sometimes heaven does not bring two people back together immediately. Sometimes the first miracle is that one person finally becomes honest with themselves. Sometimes the answer is not reunion. Sometimes the answer is clarity. Sometimes the greatest blessing is discovering what you will no longer accept. And sometimes, after two people have spent months or years misunderstanding each other, the first step toward healing is simply hearing the words. I was wrong. Your soulmate typed those words next. I was wrong. They stared at them. Then they added. I hurt you. Then. And I'm sorry. No excuses. No but. No blaming circumstances. Just responsibility. They sent it. And then they waited. You did not respond immediately. And for once, they did not panic. They understood. They knew they had spent too long expecting instant reassurance. Now they had to learn patience. They placed the phone beside them. They looked out the window. The night had fully arrived. The same world that had looked ordinary that morning now felt completely different. Because one truth had finally been spoken. And sometimes a single truth can change the direction of an entire story. But listen carefully, beloved child. Do not let this fictional story convince you that you must wait endlessly for someone. You are not required to put your life on hold. You are not required to chase silence. You are not required to decode every coincidence. Your worth does not depend on whether a particular person returns. Your worth existed before that person entered your life. Your worth remains if they stay. Your worth remains if they leave. Your worth remains if they apologize. Your worth remains if they never do. The deepest message here is not that someone is destined to return. It is that you are allowed to demand truth. You are allowed to choose peace. You are allowed to forgive without reopening a door. You are allowed to love someone and still protect yourself. And if someone comes back, let them come back with actions. Let them come back with maturity. Let them come back with consistency. Let them come back ready to build rather than merely remember. Because nostalgia can make people miss each other. But maturity is what makes two people capable of loving each other well. And tonight, in this story, your soulmate is sitting alone with that realization. They have sent the message. They have told the truth. They have admitted the fear. They have acknowledged the hurt. They have apologized. And now they are waiting to see whether the connection can become something healthier than it was before. They pick up their phone one last time. There is another message from you. Their heart begins racing again. They open it. And this time, your words are longer. They begin reading. Their expression changes. Their eyes widen. They scroll. They stop. They read the final sentence again. Because you have just revealed something they never expected. Something that explains why you disappeared. Something that changes the meaning of your silence. Something that makes them realize they misunderstood you all along. And as they reach the final line, their hands begin to tremble. Because you wrote. I didn't walk away because I stopped loving you. I walked away because I was waiting to see if you would ever choose me without being asked. Your soulmate closes their eyes. A tear rolls down their face. And in that quiet room, they finally understand. The urgency of today was never about forcing the future. It was about confronting the past. It was about finally speaking the words that fear had kept locked away. It was about realizing that love cannot be built from guesses. It must be built from truth. And as your soulmate sits there with your message glowing on the screen, they whisper the words they should have said long ago. I choose honesty now. They do not know what tomorrow will bring. They do not know whether you will forgive them. They do not know whether the relationship will return. They do not know whether the two of you will find a new beginning or simply find peace with the ending. But for the first time, they understand that they cannot control the outcome. They can only control the truth they bring to it. And that is where the story ends. Not with a guaranteed reunion. Not with a promise that everything will magically become perfect. But with two people finally standing on opposite sides of the same truth. You wanted honesty. They finally gave it. You wanted clarity. They finally began to speak. You wanted to know whether you mattered. They finally admitted that you did. And now, whatever happens next, neither of you has to live inside the same unanswered question. So if these words touched something inside you, pause. Breathe. Do not chase. Do not beg. Do not force. Let truth reveal itself through actions. Let time reveal what words cannot. And remember this above everything. You were never difficult to love simply because someone was afraid to love you properly. You were never unworthy because someone failed to communicate. You were never forgotten simply because someone remained silent. Sometimes silence tells us more about the person who is silent than the person who is waiting. And sometimes the most powerful ending is not getting the person back. It is getting yourself back. Your peace. Your confidence. Your ability to believe in love without abandoning yourself. Your ability to open your heart without handing someone the keys to your entire identity. That is the real transformation. And in this fictional story, today was the day your soulmate finally understood it. They sent the message they had been afraid to send. They said, I need to tell you what happened today. They admitted what they had hidden. They apologized for what they had broken. And they finally understood that if there is ever to be another chapter, it cannot be built on the old version of them. It must be built on truth. So the message has been delivered. The secret has been spoken. The silence has been broken. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, both hearts can breathe. Whatever happens tomorrow, let it happen naturally. Do not force the door. Do not chase the answer. If something belongs in your life, it will have to meet you with honesty, respect, consistency, and peace. And if it does not, you will still be whole. Because you were whole before the message arrived. You were whole before the silence. You were whole before the connection. And you will remain whole after it. My beloved child, take this story as a reminder that sometimes the person we are waiting to hear from is not the only person who needs a message. Sometimes the message is for us. Sometimes heaven is not saying, wait for them. Sometimes the message is saying, come back to yourself. And perhaps that is the most urgent message of all. Not every unanswered question needs another person's answer. Some answers are found when you finally stop abandoning yourself while waiting for someone else to choose you. Tonight, choose yourself. Choose peace. Choose truth. And if love returns, let it return honestly. Let it return gently. Let it return with evidence. Let it return with changed behavior. Let it return without requiring you to become smaller. Because real love should not ask you to disappear in order to keep it alive. And somewhere tonight, in the quiet fictional world of this story, your soulmate is looking at the same message one final time. The message that began with urgency. The message that carried regret. The message that finally revealed the truth. I need to tell you what happened today, it's very urgent. Please open this. They smile through their tears. Not because they know the future. But because, at last, they know the truth. And sometimes knowing the truth is the beginning of freedom. The phone screen goes dark. The room becomes quiet. The day is over. The confession has been made. And the chapter closes with one simple understanding. What was hidden has finally been spoken. What was misunderstood has finally been seen. What was feared has finally been faced. And whatever comes next, neither heart has to pretend anymore.